Well, look, let's just get back to business, because that's the best thing we can do, really. And I must say that the afternoon is kicking off with somebody that I always look forward to listening to. I've had him on my show, on the Hard Talk program. I've introduced him at various international conferences over the years. The reason being that he is one of the world's foremost thinkers and experts when it comes to discussing the whole raft of challenges that come with trying to manage a sustainable way of living on this planet. Many of you might have heard him speak before, or at least been aware through his many books and articles of his work. I'm talking, of course, about Jeffrey Sachs. He is, well, he's got so many titles, I won't give you them all, but he is the director of the Earth Institute at Columbia University in New York City. He's a professor of economics. He has advised the UN. He's been instrumental in drawing up the Millennium Development Goals and working on the Sustainable Development Goals, which are at the heart of our discussion today. He's advised governments around the world. He is, on these issues, one of the most influential people in our world today. He's won a whole gamut of awards and prizes and accolades for that influence. I know, because I know him a little bit, I mean, he just cares passionately about our future and our planet's future, and he's going to bring that insight to bear with particular regard to agriculture, food production right now. So please do give a very warm welcome to Jeffrey Sachs.
Good afternoon. On a day like today, I really like hearing Stephen's voice because he's just one of the most trusted and powerful and important voices that we listen to all the time. And I feel better in a shaken day to have you, Stephen, moderating and helping this whole program. I was reminded as I was waiting there that 15 years ago I was giving a video conference talk to South Africa from my office at Harvard University, and somebody stepped in front of the podium in Johannesburg, and I thought that was odd. I'm giving a lecture, and then they turned to me in the camera and said, "Mr. Sachs, your country is under attack." It was 9/11, and it was very frightening to even leave the halls and hear the news as everybody in that building had gathered in front of a television monitor to watch the events. But I'm also reminded of one thing that I want to say before getting started. How we react to these horrific events is even more important than the events themselves, actually. As awful and tragic and reckless and unthinkable as these events are, the United States quickly launched a war 2 months after 9/11, and then it launched an even stupider war about a year after that, and we stepped on every hornet's nest possible in Afghanistan, then Iraq, then Libya, then Syria. We're feeling a terrible blowback, unfortunately, from the stupidity and irresponsibility of my own government as part of this. This is not an excuse or an explanation of horrific acts, but it is a context, which is that we have riled matters so badly through wars of choice that we've really conjured the demons. And the only way actually to stop this is to stop the wars. Now, yesterday in the United States, even before these attacks, there was another political meeting, and Hillary Clinton was as militaristic as I've ever heard her. And then Donald Trump came on afterwards and made her look like a pacifist. It's terribly, terribly frightening. Because if our politicians react this way, which they are, we will absolutely not get any of this under control, and discussions about SDG 2 or all of the SDGs and all the rest will be useless, because there's no sustainable development in a world at war. And I always reflect around these years, every day, every provocation, that it just took one shot to start World War I. And we're not even out of World War I yet. We're still 100 years later trying to sort out the pieces of the Middle East that were tricked, bamboozled, manipulated with the fall of the Ottoman Empire, and we just can't seem to get past our own history. So sorry for the rambling, but I'm upset today, like all of us, and I'm worried, like all of us, and I'm feeling that we really need some wisdom, because if we just react and lash out and declare that we're at war and all the rest, we're not going to win any wars. The issues that I'm going to talk about today are crucial for our survival. They are crucial in orders of magnitude more than what we're experiencing, actually, because they're really existential challenges: climate change, food supply, water on the planet, biodiversity, and so on. They inevitably get pushed aside as, oh, that's the soft stuff, or who's got time for that, Mr. Sachs? We have wars to attend to. These sustainable development issues that I'm going to briefly discuss, and I want to be brief because I want to have a discussion with Stephen. I don't want to just talk. I want to hear him some more. But these issues are important for two reasons. One is they really are of fundamental significance for us. If we wreck the climate, we won't even know what hit us compared to what we're experiencing right now, and we're absolutely on a path of making the earth uninhabitable for hundreds of millions of people. So that's one point. The other is, if we actually focused on problem solving rather than warring, we might be able to focus attention of people that we now consider our adversaries actually to think about education and the future of their homes and their countries and their families. And this agenda is important also as a way to try to raise the human spirit to aim for something a little bit higher than taking out the enemy. So I'm going to talk about achieving sustainable agriculture, but it'll become very clear in just a matter of moments that agriculture can't be separated out from all of the rest of the sustainable development challenges. And indeed, sustainable development is an analytical field, which I'm with others trying to create as an analytical field. We have a new PhD program in this field and so forth, is defined by its holism, by the idea that when you study sustainable development, you're trying to analyze complex interconnected systems, natural systems like water cycle, hydrologic cycle, climatology, with human systems like our social systems, political system, economic systems. And it's the holistic vision that is crucial to actually being able to solve any of these problems. They don't come in a neat modular way. They certainly don't come in traditional academic disciplines. And no government in the world right now is organized to achieve these, because our governments are organized by vertical ministries that are 19th or 20th century modes of organization, just like our university departments. And they're not organized around problem solving. The same is true with the Commission. The European Commission is not right now organized to achieve sustainable development in Europe. And I was there yesterday speaking with a number of the cabinets and with some wonderful commissioners. But the organizational challenge is hugely profound. So there are 17 sustainable development goals. They were negotiated over 3 years by the UN General Assembly. I begged for them to come down to 10, because I tried to use the Moses precedent, that 2 tablets would be enough. 17 just seemed to me to be completely unwieldy. But the initial list was 300, and it did get down to 17, and then the governments declared success. And I was relieved about one key fact. I didn't know what we were going to do with 17 anything, because the only thing I know of 17 in nature is the locust cycle, which is not a great precedent, but a wonderful graphic artist made me realize that 17 is 3 times 6. Because you put a little box in the right-hand corner that says Sustainable Development Goals, and you have a nice graphic that now is on the walls of ministries and civil society organizations and universities all over the world. I'm going to focus on the one that has the circle around it. It's called Zero Hunger. Sometimes we call it Sustainable Agriculture. But I should highlight before moving on from this graph that SDG number 1, it says no poverty, and technically that is a goal to eliminate extreme poverty as measured by the World Bank by the year 2030. Feasible, but very, very tough. All these goals are feasible. Not one of them is on track to being achieved. I'm not an optimist or a pessimist. I'm just trying to be an analyst in the sense of what can we do, and to be constructive, how to do it. And I do believe that by being more specific, more focused, more targeted, it also makes it possible to achieve things that seem impossible. And that, to my mind, is absolutely crucial here. One more thing to say about the Sustainable Development Goals, just very briefly, is we need goals in this world because we agree on almost nothing in this world. And when we can agree on something as important as, at least you could call it idealized or a hoped-for future, and indeed the governing document was called The Future We Want, the one that established the concept of the Sustainable Development Goals, I think it's precious and invaluable. We cannot achieve big things without goals. Having goals by no means means that they're even remotely close to actually being achieved. But without goals, it's impossible to organize the efforts of 193 governments, thousands of major businesses, and more than 7 billion people on the planet. The goals help us to share a common direction if we choose to use them. Now, the particular goal of sustainable agriculture is itself an incredibly complex challenge. You've been speaking about that all day. I want to emphasize that it means at least 5 different things. And it doesn't mean one or the other. Don't pick a la carte. This is a menu fixed free. This is a whole menu that we take in trying to achieve sustainability of the agriculture sector. First, it means a way to address rural poverty, which is the dominant form of extreme poverty on the planet. It's the poverty of smallholder farmers in Africa, mostly in South Asia next, and then scattered in other parts of the world. It is about achieving nutritious diets. The world's food supply is not providing nutritious diets for at least 40% of the world right now. Completely shocking. 1 billion people have micronutrient deficiencies. Another billion people have deep, chronic protein caloric insufficiencies. Another billion people have obesity and an imbalanced diet of malnourishment through a very imbalanced diet, typically with saturated fats and high sugar content, and a lot of fast foods invented by my countrymen and polluting the world's food system. But this means that we have roughly 3 billion of 7 billion people who are not eating nutritious diets right now. That's rather shocking and sobering. The third element is climate resilience. What I mean by that is that we are on a path of climate disaster if we don't get off of it, and if we do get off of it, continued global warming and climate change for decades to come. Last month, by the way, was the warmest deviation from average in the history of all months since the beginning of counting more than 120 years ago. So February was 1.21 degrees Celsius warmer than the average of Februaries for the 20th century. This was the biggest jump of any month in the recorded history. 2015 was the warmest year on instrument record, almost surely the warmest year for thousands of years. We're on a trajectory to reach temperatures now that Earth hasn't experienced for 130,000 years. How's our food supply going to do in that context? Not well, because this temperature change means not only thermal stress, but it also means new pests. It also means more droughts, more floods, more extreme events, rising sea levels, inundation, submergence of crops. Huge problems everywhere. Now, the next challenge, I hope I'm cheering you up, is what's called planetary boundaries. That is the term of art of the ecologists to say that we're already impinging on the Earth's physical systems, the water cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the carbon cycle, and so forth. And agriculture, surprisingly, is the #1 anthropogenic sector of all parts of the economy, more than our automobiles, more than power generation. It's agriculture, because agriculture affects everything about the physical systems. It's the major user of water. It's the major reason for land degradation, for deforestation. It's the major reason for nitrogen and phosphorus flux. It is the #1 sector in anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. In other words, it's the single most important sector of driving emissions, because in agriculture, it's not just CO2, it's also methane and nitrous oxide. So and it's not only energy use, but it's deforestation. So when you add up across all of these factors, even today's farm system's not sustainable, but it's going to get hit by climate shocks. It's not yet producing enough food. And then the last part of this pentagon of woe, and pentagons seem to be areas of woe in my country as well. And that is that we have a world population of 7.3 billion people. And on the current trajectory, it will reach, drum roll, in the medium variant of the UN Population Division 2015 revision. That means technically what they published last year is their medium scenario, 11.2 billion people by 2100. My advice, don't try that. Don't try that at home, and I mean home, the planet Earth. That would be a disaster. So we have a challenge of meeting a growing population, and that growth is inevitable through population momentum, barring human disaster. But we also have to head off a tremendous population growth in Africa in particular, which in this 2015 revision goes from 179 million in sub-Saharan Africa in 1950 to 1 billion today, so mind you, 5 times since 1950, to 4 billion in sub-Saharan Africa by 2100. Impossible to be consistent with sustainable development, impossible. So that's 5 challenges, and that's just SDG 2. So you might say, Mr. Sachs, please sit down, shut up, and stop bothering us. This is very depressing. We have to be systematic in how we address this. And incidentally, our politicians are not systematic people. It's not really their job also. and our governments are not systematic. So we have to find institutions that can be systematic, long-term providers of knowledge, and that can integrate government, business, civil society around profound challenges that we face, and to do it now. And every day at war is not just one day lost, it's a multiple of days lost. It wastes our time, it leads to further deaths and destruction, and it takes us away from our most urgent challenges. So I've given a pretty complicated chart, which I won't go through, but I'll leave the chart for the conference website, describing how the various SDGs fit together for this pentagonal concept of sustainable agriculture, what the challenges are, and in every one there are challenges within the agriculture sector, but then equally or more important challenges beyond the agriculture sector. In other words, for everything that needs to be done, you need to do things holistically. The food sector by itself cannot solve even the food sector's problems. Of course, without sustainable, resilient, secure food supplies for the world, we're not going to have the attention span, the peace, the health, the social mobilization, and the political wherewithal to face the other challenges as well. Very quickly, we need healthier diets. This means, as the nutritionists have been emphasizing, less beef, less carbohydrates, more legumes, fruits. Fortunately, in Europe, you have the world's healthiest diet, the Mediterranean diet. We should all enjoy it. It's also one of the most wonderful cuisines. And it actually is the healthiest that has been studied. But that's not how we grow food right now. We don't grow food for health. We grow food for industrial yields, for mass production of staple carbohydrates. We package them in the United States in fast foods that are absolutely obesogenic. And we have not gotten serious about what healthy eating is really about. I told you about resilience. I want to stress how Europe, I could show any map of any region in the world, but Europe is under tremendous threat of agricultural resilience in climate change. And the one simple point that I would like to emphasize for you is that the Mediterranean basin is drying. That's serious. That is the cradle of Western civilization. That is some of the most beautiful and important parts of the world, and it's drying. And it's going to dry intensively if we let the warming get out of control. And you're not going to produce the olives and the vineyards and the wheat that have been the staples of European diet and survival and civilization for thousands of years in a dry and barren Mediterranean. As I mentioned, the ecologists use a concept called planetary boundaries, and this is an iconic figure from a famous paper that leading world ecologists published in 2009. It's a circle of challenges from climate change at 12 o'clock noon, ocean acidification at 1 o'clock, nitrogen and phosphorus fluxes from fertilizer use at 4 and 5 o'clock respectively, groundwater depletion, habitat destruction, and so forth. Agriculture is the #1 leading problematic sector for most of these anthropogenic drivers, human-induced Earth system changes. And as I mentioned, this is just a graph of the medium variant forecast of population. The solid line reaches 11.2 billion people by 2100 from today's level of 7.3 billion people. Now, what do we do about all of this? What's the point? It's horrible just to see a slideshow of all terrible things. And I apologize for that, although it unfortunately fits some of the mood today. We need to solve these problems. And to solve every one of these problems requires planning, foresight, expertise, and democratic engagement. Not one of these problems is solvable on a time horizon less than a generation. Not one of these, therefore, neatly fits into a political party's agenda. This is not about an election cycle. It's not about a quick win. This is about transformation of a world economy which is enormously productive, at the height of its technical and scientific prowess of all history, and yet directed in the wrong direction. Or I could say, not directed in the necessary direction. I analogize it in my own mind that we're driving a sleek, super Tesla. Maybe we're not driving a Tesla, we're driving some wonderful sports car up the mountain. And it's a beautiful day, and we've got our technological and our scientific future ahead of us. All that we can do, but you have to steer. You have to steer to avoid going over the cliff. And every one of these challenges, I make my own living studying these challenges and writing books about them. The expertise to steer exists, but there's no hand on the steering wheel. Or you could say there are 193 hands of 193 governments, or you could say there are millions of hands, and generally we're in the car and everyone's yelling at each other. And there's a war going on in the back seat. And those who are supposed to be driving are looking backwards anyway at those that are brawling behind us, Iran and Saudi Arabia, and saying, well, I'm going to jump over the front seat. Let's hope the car stays on the road. I'm going to join Saudi Arabia to beat up on Iran, or some idiocy like this. That's what Hillary said yesterday, basically. So we are not steering. That's the problem. And we're going to need new approaches. I'm going to end here in a very unsatisfactory way because this, unfortunately, I've not figured out how to discuss solutions in a short period of time, and I do want to sit down and have a chat about them rather than a lecture. But I do want to end by a piece of wisdom that I absolutely adore. It's my favorite piece of wisdom by a politician. It's in a context which I'll just take one moment to explain. And this is President Kennedy's wisdom. President Kennedy was, for me, growing up, of course, the most powerful vision of politics that I would like to see, of a politician that believed in setting goals and then setting out to achieve them. And he most famously said that he recommended to America we should send a man to the moon and return him safely back to Earth before the end of the decade. And when he did that, incidentally, there were no plans on how to do that. NASA required another year and a half, actually, to come up with its technical plans after Kennedy's call to do that. So Kennedy liked to set a vision. And when he said about the space mission, by the way, he said, we should not accept this unless you're ready to bear this burden, because this is hard. This is not easy, this is hard. Also, our politicians don't talk like that anymore. Our politicians say everything's easy. There's no sacrifice, there's no nothing. But President Kennedy said, do not accept my proposition unless you're ready to do this, because it's not simple, and there will be hardships. Well, to jump ahead a couple of years from 1961, through a lot of disasters which are interesting today to consider with President Obama in Cuba, we had the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, and Kennedy's advisors all gave him advice that would have blown up the world. And Kennedy decided after the Cuban Missile Crisis that he was surrounded by a lot of crazy generals and a reckless CIA, and that it was time actually to make peace with the other side before the planet blew itself up. And so he went on a campaign the last year of his life to make peace with the Soviet Union. And he did, because he achieved the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. And this was a remarkable achievement at the height of the Cold War, just months after the Cuban Missile Crisis. And he knew that his biggest selling job actually was to the American people, not to the Russians. He had to convince the American people that peace was possible. And he made a campaign telling the American people it's our attitude more than anything that will count of whether we can make peace with the other side, because they're also human beings. And it's possible to find a common approach. And one of the things he said in a famous peace speech in June 1963, when he was talking about the goal of peace, he said, by defining our goal more clearly, by making it seem more manageable and less remote, we help all people to see it, to draw hope from it, and to move irresistibly toward it. And that, to my mind, is a great model of leadership. Define a goal more clearly. Make it seem manageable by showing technically how it can be done, how it's to the mutual benefit. And then people can take hope from it, and they can move, as Kennedy said, irresistibly toward it. I believe, though it's very fragile, that the Sustainable Development Goals could play that role. If we do our homework, if the Commission does its work, if it's not lost forever and ever on a refugee crisis, but actually is able to focus on the future of Europe again. If countries around the world reflect on the fact that they signed on to these Sustainable Development Goals last September 25th, and they signed on to a Paris Climate Agreement on December 12th, and get their minds around the technical challenges of achieving this. And if we report to each other and work on it and study together and integrate business, academia, leading scientists, and even politicians who can follow the public will if not lead it, then it is possible to achieve these goals. I can tell you, and maybe we can discuss it, they're technically feasible. Very hard, but technically feasible. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Thank you. Well, you sure don't sugarcoat the pill. And why would you? And I don't think any of us would want you to. But I'm going to just try and ask you a couple of crude questions which might help frame it, and then I'm going to open it up to everybody else. Usually, people make presentations, and then I try and go all negative on them and sort of pick holes in the argument. But with you, it's completely the opposite. You've laid it out in a non-sugar-coated, in a bleak sort of way, the scale of the existential challenge facing us all. So I'm inclined to flip it around and be a little bit more positive. I mean, you mentioned in passing the Paris Climate Conference. I would say that actually, in terms of the commitments delivered and the goals set, delivered more than many people thought it might. I would also look at the Millennium Development Goals, and not all of them were met, but you were intimately involved with it. And you know, if one looks over the 15-year span, quite a lot of really difficult and good stuff was achieved. So is there not, when you look at the way the international community has come together on climate change in Paris, on the Millennium Development Goals, room for saying, actually, you know what? We are more capable than we think we are of delivering international commitments and making them stick?
Yes, and the interesting, I'll just mention, my approach to this has been the following. I'm an economist. That means I don't really know much of anything. And I certainly don't know much of the technical side, though it's my job to be able to be conversant with the technical experts in each area. And if you go around to technical experts and say, can the food challenge be met? They'll say, of course it can. And they'll give you a rather sophisticated account of what can be done. 15 years ago, when Kofi Annan asked me to advise him on the Millennium Development Goals, I went to the malariologist. I said, can you control malaria? Went to a fabulous late professor at London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And he laid out to me in about an hour how you would actually do it. He said to me, help. I said, well, of course I'll help, but you're the guy, you're the man who knows how to do this. He said, yeah, but I can't reach the health minister. I said, what? He said, yeah, I can't reach the health minister. I said, Chris, your office is right here. The health minister is a few blocks up. He says, yeah, Jeff, I'm a professor at the London School of Hygiene. There's such a divide between knowledge and capacity to do things. It's absolutely weird, unbelievable. But of course, whatever you see in London, look to the United States. My country is filled. We actually had a Secretary of Energy who was a Nobel laureate. He terrified the White House. He might say something true to the press. So they locked him up for 5 years. We never heard from Stephen Chu. So we're torn between the technical capacity to do things and the incredible machine that we've created, which is aimed to keep us blind in certain important ways. And this is really the biggest challenge. Now, I don't believe in leaving everything to experts.
Sometimes when you say that, it makes me think that the real enemy here is democratic government, because all of your points about short-termism, politicians and the games they play, and the way in which they refuse to be systematic and strategic in their thinking, that's democracy.
I think some of my least favorite people on the planet are politicians, not as individuals, but their job. It's almost hard to understand what that job is, except that somebody had to replace the dukes and the knights fighting all the wars. But what are they there for? You look at the U.S. Congress, the Republican Party in the U.S. Congress, to a person will deny climate change. Why? Two theories. One, they're unbelievably stupid, or two, they're unbelievably corrupt. I'll tell you the good news. It's the second one. They're not as dumb as they look. Every one of them is itching for the Koch brothers' money. So they're billionaires that have a net worth of, I don't know what it is with the oil price down, but it was $100 billion last year between the two of them. We have a crazy political system that says give all you want and give it anonymously, and that's called free speech. And they just salivate for the money. Or Hillary, by the way, is on the take of some billionaires that are hardliners. I could name the names. It's disgusting. But that's how she pays for her campaign. So yes, the democratic politics is rotten in the United States right now, and the U.S. is a danger to the world, actually, because of this. It's a corrupted system, and most Americans know it. But then Donald Trump comes and says, I'm not a politician, vote for me, and he's got a big attraction. And he's absolutely more dangerous than all the rest of them.
So without spending the rest of our time trashing we're not here just to trash the U.S. political system.
Let's do something constructive.
You said, look, this is about organizing government and politics, business, the private sector, the business people of our world, and civil society, and getting all three to work together with the public, whose minds have to be persuaded as well, to create the movement that can deliver the big change you say is the only way to save us all. So you're saying, don't rely on democratic governance.
Yep.
How does it look from the point of view of changing mindsets in business, civil society, and amongst the public?
So I'm doing everything I don't like to do, which is complaining without the constructive side. And my whole theory, which I have taken from President Kennedy's theory, is that the constructive side is show concretely what needs to be done. Al Gore made a wonderful movie, Inconvenient Truth, but it was all the gloom, and it had no solutions to it. And it didn't generate any change also, although it generated some awareness, certainly. What I've tried to do this past couple of years in the run-up to the Paris Agreement, we organized teams of energy experts in the 16 big energy-emitting countries and said, write a plan for deep decarbonization, but not a plan for economists, a plan that you can read and actually understand. In other words, all electric vehicles by such and such date. Here's where our power is going to come from and so forth. It actually had a big effect in the White House, strangely enough, and in the Chinese leadership. Why? Because the US, which could have done this 100 times over and better than us, had never done it because they're terrified actually to write down a plan, because then the lobbyists may get a hold of it and then someone may lose an election. But when I showed the plan in the White House, they said, okay, we'll support this concept of making long-term plans, which is one piece of the agreement in Paris last December. So what I really am recommending is a new kind of process where, and it sounds boring and very academic, but actually I think it's really important, and I'll explain why it's quite real also, where we need to roadmap the next 15 years of how certain things are actually going to be done. Road mapping them, not in nice goals and go out and do it private sector, but actually technically road mapping it and how certain goals are going to be met. And
give me one, because I agree with you. We can't just talk in general abstract language. We have to have specific. So we don't have much time. So
let me give a business example quickly. The way we got Moore's Law for 30 doublings of the transistor count was actually road mapping by the industry. And every year or every 2 years, the semiconductor industry group took a 10-year ahead. How do we keep 5 more doublings? What do we do in lithography? What do we do in nanotechnology and so forth to keep the doubling? Governments don't do that. They don't know how to technically roadmap what specs we need for 15 years on fertilizer uptake, nitrogen flux, varietals for thermal stress, we don't do anything so organized. The business sector doesn't love it on its own because it doesn't want to be told what to do, and IP is at the core of the business world now, intellectual property, so it doesn't really want to cooperate too much with anybody else. Government is, as I've tried to explain, not even understanding that this is what government is really about these days. So I'm a little bit looking to academia, which is a little too theoretical for my tastes, in terms of also putting forward these roadmaps. But the bottom line, use the 17 goals and say, okay, that's real. And I said to the commission yesterday, what's your plan for them? Oh, well, yes, Professor Sachs, we take them very seriously. I said, no, what's your plan for Europe for the SDGs? And we're coming back in end of May to find out whether there is such a plan.
They're very good at putting it off for a couple more months, that's true. Listen, we're almost out of time. One more from me, and then I'm going to try and get 1 or 2 audience questions in, even if we have to overrun a tiny bit. Your screen presentation talked about 2 ways in which food production, agriculture need to be held to account over the next 15 years, or at least need to be part of a huge set of solutions. One, you're saying the world's population by the end of the century may be 11 billion, and we've got to figure out how to feed them. So, of course, the inclination is to think, Christ, we've got to just grow and produce a lot more food. The other is that the way we produce food today is the dominant factor in climate change and man-made emissions. So,
crazy.
Put it crudely, which is more important for people in the agriculture sector to think about today, cutting emissions or expanding production?
First, we should not get to 11 billion. And if you want to slow population growth, there's one way to do it and help Europe pay for it, and that is girls' education in Africa. If you take SDG 4, which is universal secondary education, and keep girls in school, the fertility rate will come down sharply, and what is 11 billion could actually peak at 8.5 billion. And if you want to avoid the migration crisis that you can't even imagine, help girls in Africa get educated, please. And
well,
so that's number one. And second, of course, you asked earlier in the day about do we need higher productivity and intensification. Absolutely yes, unfortunately. We'd love to go to a simpler world, but we're going to be 8.5 billion no matter what we do. And that means that we're going to need to find better ways to produce and to produce the right kinds of foods.
Although we were told by, I think it was Ben earlier on, that we actually produce enough food calories to serve 11 billion people already. The problem is it's all about the distribution. It's about who gets what, and you know, do we really need intensification or just?
I'm not so sure. That's a UN line, which there's a little bit of truth to it, but I don't think it's the key truth, actually. We need higher yields in Africa for sure, because Africa's food dependent. It could produce a lot more. The productivity is extraordinarily low. And that's because there's no mechanization and because the technology is completely deficient. And we're going to need high tech in food, in varieties of seeds, in precision agriculture to cut down fertilizer use and cut down pesticide use, integrated pest management technologies, and so forth, if we're going to do this at lower impact and a nutritious diet, and one that is resilient to the climate change that's coming. And one more thing about all of these scenarios. Population doesn't have to reach 11.2 billion, and temperature dare not exceed 2 degrees C, believe me. That goal was set for a reason. My lead colleague says, Jeff, you're crazy even to mention that goal. It's already too dangerous. Even if we reach 2 degrees C, we're already 1.2 degrees C above pre-industrial. But the point is, we need an absolutely aggressive decarbonization of the energy system, completely feasible. Pay off Polish mine workers. This is not about Poland's coal. This is about saving the planet. And get this job done, because otherwise we'll never keep up, Stephen, with the food supply. We cannot grow the food supply we need in a climate-deranged world.
Okay, well, I unfortunately, being a really useless time manager, seem to have overrun already. So I'm going to say we're going to get one, it's like a golden ticket. There's only going to be time for one question to Jeff, and no pressure, it better be a good one. So all these confident people with their arms up, ma'am, I'm going to go to you because you're smiling at me, and that's nice. So you won the golden ticket.
I thought she was smiling at me.
Well, possibly. But it's the only question for Jeffrey, so let's hear it.
Thank you very much indeed. My name is Philippa Evans-Bevan. I farm in Ireland, and I also work for Savills Rural in Europe. My question is about two things, about communication and education. And I'm going to steal two things that Stephen has actually said today. He started earlier and he used the expression, the tyranny of the clock. And the tyranny of the clock is that in 2030, children who start school today will be the consumers of 2030. So if sustainability is something which I believe very, very strongly is market-driven, because it has to have an economic ability, those consumers in 2030 are going to be very important to us. So we need to get them to help us with the roadmap. We need to understand that they are very bright, they're very capable of absorbing a lot of this high-tech and important information. And within schools, alongside the Minister of Agriculture in all our countries and the Minister of Health, who don't seem to speak to each other, we also need to shut them in a room and lock it with the Minister of Education. And all those education authorities across the world should be saying, our children's education in life for food, or food for life rather, is critical to the outcomes of the world that you live in and future generations. And I strongly believe that the badge of honor that Stephen Sachs' father used to feel he got for his yields is something that should be right up there at the front. Top of the class in maths, top of the class in English, in sport. You won the award for this, that, and the other. But the highest badge of honor could be the badge for life for food and food education and understanding all of those things. And I think it's also particularly interesting that on my telephone, I've had more texts and more emails from young people in Ireland, Italy, the UK today asking if I'm okay. These guys are very well connected and they know how to communicate, and we should educate them now.
Thank you for that. That's really interesting. And maybe that's a great way. I mean, do you believe that the key to, you said this is just really difficult stuff and it's about the next 50 years, not the next 15, which the SDGs technically cover. Do you believe the key to it does lie in the kids who are being educated today?
For 15 years with the MDGs, which were about fighting extreme poverty, I always resisted saying which of them is my favorite, your favorite child, of the 8 MDG goals. But with the Sustainable Development Goals, I'll come right out and say that SDG 4, which is universal quality education, is the pillar for everything. Because if we lose another generation, it's impossible that we're going to get this right. Now, mind you, a young girl in Africa right now, in a sub-Saharan African country, might have a 10% chance of finishing high school on the current trajectory. This is crazy. As an economist, I can tell you that even if these poor countries were completely directed in the right direction, run by saints, they don't have enough domestic budget to be able to pull off universal education. So just as 15 years ago, I helped to invent something called the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB, and Malaria, Kofi Annan took it up, and actually George W. Bush, strangely enough for me, made it happen, because I disagreed with him on almost everything, but he played a very constructive role on this. We need a global fund for education to make it possible for poor countries to achieve the quality education that gives them a chance in this century. Now, of course, in rich countries, we have our own homework to do, but it's not a resource limit. It's a vision, it's a political limit, but in the poor countries, we need that. Just a note, Gordon Brown was tasked by UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and the Norwegian government, which has set up a commission on education. He will report this spring a set of recommendations. I'm pushing as hard as I can every government to encourage a bold recommendation to say that the world, and that means us, which we don't like to do, but it's the truth, that rather than funding wars, we will actually fund education. Now, I'll just conclude, because I could go on for about 6 hours on this theme now that you got me started. The United States spends $2 billion a day on the military. $2 billion. If you add up the Defense Department, the CIA, Homeland Security, and 20 other secret things, I don't even know what they're called. And we spend 1/25 of that on development assistance. Can you imagine what a messed up country? But that country is messing up the world. And since the US is so powerful and everyone likes the US, not everyone likes the US, but everyone likes to say they like the US, that are our, quote, allies, because we're allies together, please tell the truth to the United States. We cannot survive on a 25-to-1 ratio. The United States has to cut the military and build the civilian world help, because we're awfully rich. We're a $20 trillion economy, awfully greedy, awfully rich at the top, and awfully militarized. And so I won't rant anymore, but anyone that wants a cell phone recording as your answer, a Sachs rant about the US, I'll be happy to provide it. But we've got to devote the resources to this, and it's crazy. 2 or 3 days of Pentagon spending, you end malaria, you get AIDS under control, you do all sorts of wonderful things. And I keep telling the Pentagon, take a vacation, okay?
Well, I thought it was a very interesting set of comments, and you know what it makes me think? That the most valuable thing you do, and God knows I think this afternoon for all of us has been valuable, but the most valuable thing you do isn't talk to old farts like us, but it's actually the teaching you do, the interaction you have in your working life with young people, because that's, you know, they're the people who probably are going to do most to build on the message.
They want so much a better world, and if we can help them do it, they will pick it up, that's for sure.
All right. Well, listen, it has been a pleasure to have you here, Jeffrey. The conference, we're running a little bit late, so you and me need to get off the stage pretty darn quick. But ladies and gentlemen, please thank Jeffrey Sachs.
Thanks a lot.